But somebody's got to begin to fight. Somebody's got to begin to fight for their kids, fight for the future. See, some things are worth fighting for. I think your kids and your future is worth fighting for. I think your marriage is worth fighting for. I think changing some things that have happened in the past, I think that fight is worth it so that then the next generation can walk in the blessing. There was a lady, and every morning when she got up, she would look out her window and she would see an older man, her neighbor, sitting on his front porch swing and just swinging back and forth. And every morning he just looked so happy and had this huge smile on his face. And she just did not understand why. And so one day she decided, I'm just gonna go ask him. And I'm gonna talk to him and see what is going on, what has made him so happy all these years. And so she walks over and she says, hi sir, I'm your neighbor. She goes, I'm not stalking you, but every day I look out my window and I see you sitting on the front porch and you have the biggest smile and you just look so happy. And she goes, can you just tell me what's the secret to happiness in life? And what have you done to get this way? And he says, well, he said, to be honest with you, I smoke 3 packs of cigarettes every day. I drink heavily. And I eat whatever I want. And she looks so confused and she's like, what? And he goes, yeah. And she goes, how old are you? He goes, 26. Come on, that's good. Yes, man. Hey, listen, we are in week number 2 of family therapy. And this is just a time for us to really kind of be honest with each other, look at some things in our family that we need to deal with, that we need to talk about, lay on the couch and just get a little honest with each other. And so in this series, I met with a guy and I was talking with a guy who's a very successful businessman. And he's done very, very well for himself, millions and millions of dollars. And I was sitting down talking to him, asking him questions about leadership, about business, about what he's done to get to this point, how he's become so successful, what it took to get to this point. And as we're talking and he's sharing and everything like that, and then we kind of go into, hey, what are some fears and different things like that. And it was interesting because as we're sitting there, he just kind of looks and he says, well, to be honest with you, he said, I'm really nervous to give my business to my kids. And I was like, what? Because it didn't make sense to me because his kids work for the business. They do a really good job. And I said, I don't understand. I said, because looking from the outside in, I said, it looks like you've done a good job and your kids, are ready to go. And he said, let me tell you, he said, it's the 3rd generation. And he said, what you have to understand about the 3rd generation is, he said, see, my dad didn't have anything. He said, my dad was very poor. He said, we struggled to get by. And he said, but then he decided to start a company. He goes, it didn't go real well. He goes, he didn't make very much money. He struggled his whole life. And he said, and I watched that struggle. And he said, and then when it came my turn, he said, I came in. He said, I took that business. And he goes, I've turned it into what it is today. And he said, I fought and I worked hard and I've put in the time and I've put in the energy and I've put in the effort. And he said, and I knew what it was to go without. I knew what it was to spend all night in the office working. I knew what it was to not get the deal that I needed to get to be able to pay the employees what they needed to get paid. He says, I know what it's like not to be able to take a paycheck home. And he says, but now, he goes, everybody looks at this and everybody just thinks, man, this is great. And he says, but they don't understand the struggle. And he said, the problem is this. He said, my kids have always had everything they ever wanted. He goes, because the struggle was before my kids were ever born. And he said, they've always had what they've wanted and it's always been easy. And he said, see, the problem with easy is a lot of times, if you don't understand the struggle, then you can take the blessing and you can destroy the blessing because it's too easy. That's right. And I was like, what? And he said, so I'm nervous because they don't understand what it took to get here is what it's going to take to maintain it. And he said, because everything for them is just easy. He said, I wanted to give that to them. I wanted them to have that. I wanted them to have the blessing, but I want them to understand along with the blessing is also hard work. And he said, and I think that's what they're missing right now, and that's what I'm trying to instill in them, but I just hope I'm not too late. I was like, good grief. That's incredible. And I started thinking, and I began to think of the children of Israel. And isn't this really a picture of the children of Israel? Look at what Judges 2:10-12 says. It says that whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. They died. After them, another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works that he had done for Israel. And it said the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped false gods and abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. See, what had happened is the children of Israel went into captivity. Then Moses came along and they were delivered out of captivity. Then they spent 40 years wandering around. And then they finally enter into the promised land. But then once they got into the promised land, everything wasn't great because then they began to turn to false gods rather than begin to follow God. And so it's just this weird cycle that begins to take place. My dad and really my brother and I have a conversation sometimes just about different things. But one of the conversations that we have is about alcohol. My dad is a very strong believer that alcohol is absolute sin, terrible. There's nothing good about alcohol. Me and my brother don't have as strong of a stance on that as my dad. And we've begun to have conversations and wonder why. Why is it that we don't have as strong a stance on that view as my dad does? Well, what you have to understand is my dad grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad grew up where his dad was getting drunk every night. My dad grew up in a home where, as a teenager, he would have to go into the bar and he would have to grab his grown dad and he would have to drag him kicking and screaming and fighting out of the bar home. And he would have to take his dad and lay him in bed and put him to bed at night. And then this cycle just kept continuing and continuing and continuing. And so my dad doesn't drink alcohol. I've never seen alcohol in my parents' home in my entire life. But the reason that my dad has such a strong view is because my dad witnessed something firsthand that I never witnessed. See, because of my dad and what my dad chose to do as a father, I never had to see the effects of what alcohol could do. I never had to go into the bar and pull my dad out of the bar and bring him home and put him in bed. I never had to watch my dad get so drunk, stumbling around and get loud and screaming and lose his mind. I never had to watch any of that because my dad never did that. And so my view of alcohol is not as strong because I didn't see it firsthand. See, because what I saw was something from a distance. What I saw was what I heard through stories. And so my view is a different view. But today I'm not an alcoholic because my dad fought to break that curse that was in our family. And so I don't have alcohol in my house because my dad fought and my dad stood and said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It can be dangerous. It can destroy your family. It can destroy your marriage. It can destroy your relationship with your kids. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. I haven't seen anything good come from this. And so because of him and the way that he fought, now I'm living in the blessing. But the scary thing is this, is that my kids don't understand the fight that my dad had to go through because of what my grandpa had gone through, so that I don't have to have that struggle and they don't have to have that struggle. But the problem is, the farther we get from the fight, the easier it is to go back and forget why we got in the fight in the first place. See, some of you are fighting right now in order to keep your kids from having to fight so that your kids can experience a blessing. Amen. Some of you are struggling through an addiction and you need somebody to begin to fight. Some of you are walking in a blessing, but yet you don't understand the cost that it took in order to be able to walk into that blessing. And so today I want us to understand what it takes in order for us to be able to live in the blessing. Because the blessing didn't come free. The blessing came through purpose and pain. And so the first thing I want you and I to look at is this. It's the foolish. When I begin to look at the children of Israel, I think there's kind of three different categories that I want to label them as. The first one is this, foolish. And the foolish is the one who has taken the blessing and squandered the blessing and turned the blessing into a curse. They've taken what was good and they've turned it into something that's bad. See, the children of Israel were in captivity for 400 years. 400 years they were slaves. And after that 400 years, God delivered them out of that slavery. And the crazy thing is, they are only 11 days away from the promised land after they had been delivered out of captivity. But yet the 11 days turned into 40 years because they were foolish. The blessing that was in front of them, the blessing that God had promised, the blessing that's on their doorstep turned into a 40-year journey, not allowing a generation to go into the promised land because of their rebellion and disobedience to God. How in the world can we have it so good but yet screw it up so badly? See, I think every parent in here says, I want to give my kids the best. I want my kids to have it different than I had it. I want them to have it a little more easy than I have it. But here's the problem. When we give them everything and it costs them nothing, then there's no value to the everything that we're giving them. They don't understand how important it is. When I was growing up, I had to buy my own car when I turned 16. So did my brother. We both had to buy our cars. And so my sisters didn't. My mom and dad bought them their car, but we had to. And so I had worked and saved and worked and saved. And I had about $6,500 that I had saved up. And I was looking around trying to find a car. The car I wanted was a Nissan Maxima with a big spoiler on the back and some rims on it. That was about $16,000. I was short just a little bit. So my grandpa picks up the phone and calls me and goes, Johnny Dean, that's my name, Johnny Dean to him. He says, I found you a car. Says it's a 1994 Ford Tempo. Said it's had one owner. He says it's a light blue. And he says it's got 20,000 miles. It's basically brand new. They had a camper and they pulled it behind their camper. I'm getting pumped because everything I was looking on had 250,000 miles, 3 wheels, and, you had to put a foot out to keep it up. So I was like, this sounds amazing. I was like, yes, I'll take it. So he bought the car. My mom drove down one day, picked the car up, brought it out. Now remember, I went to a private school. One of my friends had a brand new BMW 5 Series. Another friend had a Saab convertible. Another friend had a Porsche 911 convertible. Another friend had a Hummer, not the H2s, the H1 Hummer. Another friend had a Yukon that was jacked up, had the tires bigger than my whole car. And so my mom's like, I'll have it sitting out front when you get out of school. So I'm like, yes. I'm telling all my friends, I'm like, my car's here. I come out, We didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have a big bow. I had like a little bow that you put on like baby dolls sitting on top of the car. And I'm looking, I'm like, where's my car? And all of a sudden I see this baby blue 4-door Ford Tempo sitting right there. And I'm like, oh. But you know what? That Porsche was a lot nicer than mine. Couldn't go much faster than mine. At 70, mine had like these massaging seats, and it was incredible. Just the features it had on it. When you got to a certain speed, you couldn't hear the radio because the engine was so loud. It was a fun thing to drive. But they had a lot nicer cars, but do you know what? I valued mine more than they valued theirs. Every weekend I went out and I washed and waxed that thing. I promise you, in all the world, there was not a better looking Ford Tempo than the one that I have. I promise you. The tires were always shiny. The car was always vacuumed. It was always waxed. It always looked good. Why? Because the value was different because I put it into it. No matter how expensive or how much you want to give to your kids, if they don't understand the value, they will squander it away. They'll lose it. They don't understand it. And here's the cycle of what the children of Israel are going through. They don't understand how good God is because the distance of the time that they've seen God do these things, or the conversations have stopped happening and they're not telling them anymore. So that time begins to create a gap, and that gap begins to create a less value of how big and how good God was in those moments, in those circumstances. And so what they were foolish. Because they took the blessing and they turned it into a curse. Because they took the blessing and they devalued the blessing. And they didn't honor the blessing. And so then the curse began to come. And isn't it interesting, when they were in the wilderness, they had cried for freedom, but yet after they had cried for freedom, while they were in the wilderness, they complained about the freedom that they had. Look at what it says in Exodus 14, verse 11. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to the desert to die? We were just fine dying in Egypt. We asked for freedom and now we're coming out here and now we're just gonna die in the desert? This is what freedom is? This is where you've brought us? Isn't it interesting that what they desired also became their bitterness? Because it didn't match the picture that they had of freedom. See, some of you need to get free of some things in your life. Maybe some of you, what's happening and what's going on is a picture that's been painted for you, is a family picture that divorce has happened for generation after generation after generation after generation. And you watched your grandparents and that marriage fall apart. You watched your parents and that marriage fall apart. And now you have a marriage. And the expectation is that it's probably going to fall apart because that's what happens. Maybe it's addiction. And maybe you've watched family member after family member after family member struggle with addiction. And for some reason, you've picked it up and you thought, I can handle it. But the problem is you can't. And the blessing of your life now turns into a curse. The blessing of a marriage has turned into something that you never thought it would be. The blessing of kids has now turned into something that you never thought they would be doing what they're doing. And what you had done as a teenager and a young adult, now all of a sudden you're watching your kids make the same mistakes you did and you never thought they would and you never hoped and prayed that they would, but yet you're watching them make those same mistakes. This is the cycle of the children of Israel. This is what they continue to do. See, the interesting thing is they saw the miracles of God, but in spite of seeing the miracles of God, they still lacked faith in God. Can you imagine walking up to the Red Sea with an army chasing behind you and there's 2 million plus people standing there? And Moses is looking and going, God, you brought us here, now what do we do? And God says, stretch out your staff, I'll take care of it. Moses stands there, stretched out his staff. All of a sudden, a wall of water, a wall of water. It's dry ground. It's not muddy ground. It's not ground where their carts are going to get stuck in. It's dry ground. All of a sudden, they begin to walk across just like normal ground. All 2 million of them get across, and the army begins to cross, and they begin to get nervous. And all of a sudden, when they all get across, the water falls back in and destroys the entire army. They watch as every morning they're, God, we're hungry. God, we need something to eat. And God gives them bread and meat every single morning. Just enough for the day. And then on Saturdays, enough for Saturday and Sunday. And then every day they watch as they follow God through a pillar of fire. They watch as they're walking through the desert and they're going, God, we're thirsty. And he tells Moses, hey, that rock's got some water in it. Have you ever found a rock full of water? And they continue to see the miracles of God, but yet they lack faith in God. Isn't it interesting? That's what we do a lot of times. We see God work in our life. We see God move. We see God move in other people's lives. We see miracles all around us, but yet when we look to God and we're like, I don't think God can. God's big enough to part the Red Sea. He's not big enough to help me with my cough. And we doubt God. And this is the cycle of the children of Israel following God. Psalm 78:42 says, they did not remember his power. The day he redeemed them from their oppressor. They didn't remember God's power or the day that he had saved them. They didn't remember it. The next thing is this, the fighter. This was Moses. Exodus 5:1, Moses stands before Pharaoh. God called Moses. Moses was nervous about the calling. Moses didn't believe in the power that God had placed inside of him. Moses tried to tell God, no, please don't use me. Pick somebody else. God says, you're the man. Moses says, well, I can't speak. And he says, well, then I'll have somebody else speak for you. And so everything that Moses, all the excuses Moses kept coming up with, God kept saying, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you. And so Moses stands before Pharaoh. Moses says, God says, let his people go. The most powerful man on the face of the earth at the time. Moses stands and says, let the people who are building your city, that are under your control, that have no power, that are weak, let them go. And after 10 plagues, Pharaoh lets them go. And they begin to move. But here's what I want you to understand. If something's going to change, then you can't continue to do the same thing over and over and over. Do you know insanity? The definition is to think that I'm going to do the same thing over and over and over and expect a different result the next time. It's insane for me to think that I am going to continue to eat the exact same way that I've always eaten, to put on the weight that I have put on, and yet lose weight this time for some reason. That's insanity. I'm going to continue to eat ice cream at night. I'm going to continue to eat, terrible food that has no nutrient value in my life. But this time when I eat it, my thinking is I'm losing weight. So I must be losing weight. They're going to look at me and be like, you're the dumbest person I've ever met in my entire life. But yet that's what we do so many times. We think God is going to do something different without us changing anything in our lives. Listen, if you want to break a chain in your family, if you want to stop something, if you don't want the marriage that your parents had, then you've got to do something different than what your parents did. If you don't want the same result that you see, then you can't treat your wife the same way that you saw your dad treat your wife.
That's right.
If you don't want to be an alcoholic, then listen, stop bringing it into the house. I don't know how many times I have conversations with people who struggle with alcoholism. I just sat down with somebody this past week, And I said, stop going to the store and buying it and putting it in your house and then thinking you have the strength to say no. You've got to stop doing what you've seen, take them down the path that they were down, but expect that when you do this, it's going to be a different result for you and your family this time. I'll tell you that if you act like your dad, you're going to have the relationship that your dad had. If you act like your mom, you're going to have the relationship that your mom had. See, if you didn't have a relationship with your mom or dad, but you desire to have a relationship with your kids, but yet you treat your kids the same way that your mom and dad treated you, you're not going to have that relationship. You've got to do something different. I don't need to tell my kids I love them. They know. They know. My dad never told me he loved me. Do you think your dad loved you? I'm not sure. I think so. I mean, he never told me, but I think so. So you think your kids? Oh, my kids know. When did you tell them last? Yeah, I haven't. I don't know when we got this idea that being a man means keeping your emotions in and not telling somebody that you love them. Listen, I tell my wife every day I love her. Why? Because I don't want to forget it. I don't want her to forget it. Not me. I don't forget it. I know. She tells me. No, I love her and I want her to know it every single day because listen, words are cheap if actions don't follow. And so here's what we've got to do. You and I have got to become fighters if we want something to change. Moses was the fighter for the children of Israel. Do you know the interesting thing? Moses wasn't allowed to go to the promised land. Moses didn't enter. Some of you are going to fight to keep something away from your kids, but you're never going to experience the blessing. Some of you are just going to have to fight and your kids are going to be able to inherit the blessing that you're never going to be able to see. That's what this guy that I was talking to, that's what he was talking to me about his dad. He said, my dad started the business. And he said, but it was never anything like what it is today. He didn't see that. He would be blown away if he saw this. He couldn't even imagine what's going on right here. See, some of you, your kids are going to get a blessing because of the fight that you're going to put in now. Some of your kids are going to be, they're not going to have to struggle the way that you struggled because of the fight that you're putting in right now. But somebody's got to begin to fight. Somebody's got to begin to fight for their kids, fight for the future, fight for what they need to. The third thing is this. It's the blessed. This is the one that, listen, they experience the blessing and live in the blessing of God. The children of Israel went to the promised land, and the interesting thing about when they got to the promised land, after 40 years of wandering, after watching all that God had done, they finally get to the promised land. When they get to the promised land, it wasn't Moses that was taking them in, it was Joshua. Joshua sends 12 spies and says, go look at the land that God has already said he's given to us. Hey, that's yours. It's just under somebody else's name right now, but it's already yours. I've given it to you. Now I just need you to go take it. Children of Israel march down there. Then they stand and they're like, oh my goodness. These guys are huge. They have muscles everywhere. We can't beat them. They're bigger than us. But why does fear come in? And the cycle begins all over again? Because they had forgotten what God had done, because that distance had been created, because they didn't realize the fight that it took in order to get to where they are. That in order to get the blessing, you may still have to fight. And in order to keep the blessing, you may still have to fight. See, some things are worth fighting for. I think your kids and your future is worth fighting for. I think your marriage is worth fighting for. I think changing some things that have happened in the past, I think that fight is worth it so that then the next generation can walk in the blessing. Because I want my kids to walk in the blessing. But here's the fear that I have of my kids and my grandkids is that Heather and I did everything we could in order to fight, in order to start this church. There was struggle like my kids will never understand because they were so little that they can't fathom and comprehend. Everything to them was just fun. But there were days that we didn't have enough money to really go get food. There were months that we didn't get paychecks, and we're sitting there and we're just on our knees and we're just praying, God, you have to provide. Now, my kids are on the other side of that. They've never had a moment in their life where they've had to sit at a table and go, God, I need you to provide. God, I need you to show up. God, I need you to pay this bill. God, I need you to make sure that we can keep the lights on at the church. I need you to make sure that we can pay the mortgage so that we can make sure that people still come through the doors of the church. They don't see that side because what they see now is the blessing of what God's done from the fight that took place years ago in front of them. So now the concern is this: when another fight comes up, they're not ready for the battle because all they've been doing is walking in ease and comfort. And so you've got to make sure that your kids are ready for the fight, even if they're walking in the blessing. Because here's the thing, no matter what you're walking through, it can get tough. And the promised land can get hard because not everybody wants you to stay in the promised land. So guess what? Even though they were in the promised land, guess what? People still attacked them. People still came at them. People still tried to take it away. People still tried to take the land back, and they had to stand and fight in spite of being in the promised land, in spite of being in the full blessing of God. See, for some of you, we're not teaching our kids to be able to understand that just because we're living in a blessing doesn't mean we don't have to prepare for a fight. And you've got to get ready. And the problem is when we don't prepare our kids and we just give and give and give and give and give, the problem is what's going to happen is it's going to turn back into foolishness. And then somebody else is going to have to fight. And so we've got to be on guard as parents. And we've got to make sure that no matter where we are, for some of you, you've walked through the doors today and you're in that foolishness spot. You're struggling. You're living in the same cycle that your family's been living in their whole life. You're living in poverty. And you're doing the same job that your grandpa did, that your great-grandpa did, that your dad did. And you show up every single day and you go to work and you punch a clock. And you come home and you look at your budget every single month and you're looking and you're going, I don't know how we're going to make it. And then you work a little overtime and then you go back and the next month you do the same thing. But there's something stirring inside of you that God's breeding inside of you, and God's putting a vision inside of you that wasn't a vision put in your dad, that wasn't a vision put in your grandpa, but now there's a vision inside of you. But the problem is that it's going to take a ton of work that nobody before you've done, so you're too scared to step out and do it. So you continue to live in the foolishness. Or maybe it's the addiction. Maybe it's the broken marriage. Maybe it's the kids falling apart. And nothing changes. And so the last thought is this: we need some curse breakers. We need some generational curse breakers. We need some people that are going to step in and say, it stops with me. It's not going past me. And it stops with me so that my kids, I'm going to be the fighter that they need me to be. I'm breaking this. It's not going to be them. I may not be able to enter the promised land. I may not be able to live in the blessing, but I'm not afraid of the fight. And I'm going to fight so that they can enjoy the blessing, so that they can live in the blessing. But in that fight, I'm also going to teach them that you've got to continue to fight. Because listen, I think with all my heart, the greatest days of the church are not the days that I'm going to pastor. They're not. It's the next generation. It's my kids that are going to be able to stand up. My prayer is my kids are part of the church. That's my prayer. I don't know if it will happen. That's my prayer. And I think that's going to be the greatest generation. And that's going to be the generation that gets the blessing. But they've got to continue to fight. We need some curse breakers. We need some people that are going to stand up for their family and go, it stops with me. I'm fighting. Listen, the fight's not easy. The children of Israel had an 11-day journey to the blessing. Can you imagine being Moses? Now read the story again and understand how frustrated Moses is. Because it's an 11-day journey to the blessing. And Moses is like, come on, guys. We just crossed the Red Sea. Everybody's dead. We're good. All we got is 11 days, and life is going to be awesome. Oh, Moses, I'm tired. We should have just died back there. I'm hungry. Oh, where's God? This is terrible. And Moses is like, and he's got 40 years of fighting. Can I tell you, your fight might not be easy? Yes. But do you know what the Bible says? God took Moses up onto the mount, and he says, I'm not going to let you enter, but I'm going to let you see it. And he stood, and he looked over at what was fixing to come. They weren't there yet. But I think God gave Moses a vision. Yes. Moses, you've worked for 40 years. You've been faithful. You've fought. This is what's coming. I want you to see it. Yes. And I think Moses saw what he had been fighting for 40 years. Maybe what needs to happen, you won't experience the blessing, but you're going to be able to see. You're going to be able to see the blessing that God's going to give. You're going to step back and you're going to go, oh my goodness. God, I don't need to be a part. I'm just glad I was in the fight. I'm just glad I was able to prepare a way. God, I'm willing to suffer a little bit for them to be able to have the blessing, for them to be able to have it a little different than I had it. I want them to have a better marriage. I want them to have a better relationship with their kids. I want them to have a better relationship with you. Heather's grandpa, he started a company. He had nothing. And he started a bag company, a plastic bag company. Heather's family makes plastic bags. And he started with just buying a machine, and then he printed all the bags and did everything himself, by himself, sent them out. The company has now grown. It's massive. I don't know how much money he's worth. If you met him, you wouldn't even know. He buys his clothes at Walmart, doesn't care about anything, like just a down-to-earth guy. But here's the thing. If you go to his backyard and you take a metal detector, you will begin to go through his backyard and you will start getting these dings. And all of a sudden you'll start finding some cans. And in those cans are money. You know why that's there? Not because he doesn't have enough money in the bank account. There's no telling how much he has. But because he lived through the Great Depression. Do you know, I look at him and I'm like, that's crazy. Give me that money. I'll do something with it. But his perspective is a little different than mine because of what he's walked through and what I haven't. So it's my job to honor his perspective and understand what he's been through so that I don't devalue what he's valued for us in the future. Amen. Just because you haven't walked through it doesn't mean it's not scary. Doesn't mean you don't need to worry about it. Doesn't mean you don't need to get on your knees and pray your kids away from it. Listen, just because I'm not an alcoholic does not mean that I do not need to be on my knees praying for my kids, going, hey, God, do not let this get a hold of them, because I know in our family we have seen it. We know what happens. We know what can happen. And so do not let this get a hold of them. Just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean I don't need to be on my knees praying for them. Just because we have a good relationship as a husband and wife does not mean I don't need to be on my knees praying and saying, God, protect my kids, bring the right person along so that then their marriage can be healthy and whole and not a wreck and a havoc and broken. And so I'm praying even though I may not be walking through the situation. Will you pray with me?